Hello everybody, welcome back to Alan Wall's Photography. I'm Alan and this is episode number 3 in our Basics of Lightroom tutorial series. The first 2 videos we talked about the library and we looked at the catalog and how you put your imported photographs into files and folders and how you arrange those and how you use collections. So we're done with all of that. We're going to get down to the real business, probably what you came here for in the first place, and that is editing your raw images. If you aren't shooting raw yet, go out and shoot some raw images because you really need to be editing in raw. When you edit in JPEG format, you end up with not very good photographs because that is, as we've talked about before, that's a lossy format that when you make edits and then save it, the material that wasn't used in the edit gets thrown out and you can't get it back. Raw files, on the other hand, don't throw any of that information away ever. So you can create a series of edits and copy them and apply them to another photograph or another 1,000 photographs. You can edit your photograph 15 times and come back and start all over again because all the information remains in the file. So there's no other way to do it but raw, so be sure to shoot in raw. There are 2 general concepts I think about when I'm teaching people how to use Lightroom or edit in any program for that matter. The first is that a number of the simpler editing tools are global in their application, meaning they are basically making changes to the whole photograph. And today we're going to be talking about the basic panel, which deals with lighting and textures within the whole photograph. Most of what we're going to be dealing with from this episode on is going to be how to make local changes. In other words, how to apply editing changes to one particular selected part of the photograph. Incredibly powerful tool, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me show you very quickly the layout of the develop module. There's normally a panel on the left that I have minimized because that panel is only going to be relevant when we've done some editing. It's really ways to track your edits for a given photograph, and we'll get into it later. The right-hand side, where we're going to be working for the next several weeks, starts with a histogram. This is not the same histogram from the library module. This histogram is incredibly powerful. There is a lot that you can do with it. You can, in fact, do most of your basic editing just in the histogram. And in fact, it's so useful for that is going to be episode 4. Once we've gone through the basics of editing, then I'll come back and show you how you can do a lot of that in the histogram. The histogram, as you know, is full of cool information. When your photograph that you're working on is highlighted in your film strip, then your camera information will show up underneath the histogram. And that's all you need to know for right now, except for these little doodads up in the corners. These are very important and we'll be using them today. We'll be using them next week as well. These are clipping indicators. I won't get into the details of it, but as long as they are not lit up, you are not clipping your highlights or your shadows. And we will be doing things to make sure that we don't do that because that's when you start losing detail. But that's enough of that for now. We'll get into much more of that later on. This is the toolbar, and it gives you 6 tools now. They keep adding tools, which is nice. This is the crop tool. This is the spot removal tool for removing blemishes and what have you. This gets rid of red eye. I love the red eye in it. In case you wonder what that does, just hover over it. This is a graduated filter. This is a radial filter, And this is the best tool in the whole box. This is your adjustment brush. We've got a whole episode just dealing with how to use those tools. We won't be touching any of them today. What we will be doing today is working our way through the basic panel. And I'm not going to say anything else about it because that's what we're talking about today. In the future episodes, we're going to talk about using the tone curve. It's got its own panel. Also, the hue, saturation, and luminance panel, which is where you handle a lot of your color adjustments. Split toning, detail, lens corrections, transformations all have important roles in editing your pictures, but every one of them deserves its own episode because there's a lot you can do with each of them. Today, we're going to just take one photograph picked at random from the library, and I have removed any edits that I had done to it, and we're going to use this as an example as we go through the basic panel. Okay. The treatment, which is the first thing you can choose from in the treatment panel, that determines whether or not you are going to be doing a treatment in color or a treatment in black and white. And it is as simple as pressing one button or the other to determine that. The next section down is profile. Adobe has a number of profiles that have been configured. They kind of mimic the profiles that your camera may have. You may have settings in your camera for standard and portrait and vivid. That's all good and well. And if you want to take advantage of those instead of building the edit yourself, you can. But it kind of goes against the point of this tutorial series. This is one of those things, once you learn how to edit, go back and play around with these and see if any of them provide you with a useful shortcut that you could use. But let's learn how to actually do the edit first. If you want to see all of the profiles that are available, click on the 4 little boxes on the right-hand side. It will show you a whole bunch of Adobe RAW profiles, as well as some artistic and weird looking vintage profiles. I really don't use any of them, but they're all there if you want to look at them, and they're fun to play with. If you are in this module and you want to see what the image would look like with that treatment, you just double click on it and it will apply those changes to your photograph. But we're not going to put it in modern O2. We're going to leave it in Adobe Color for now. Okay, now white balance. White balance, of course, is very important. The white balance that your camera uses is prone to cause problems in your photography if you don't forget to change your white balance as your photography conditions change. If you're out there with a white balance set on cloudy and you're shooting in bright sunlight, you're going to get some odd looking pictures. And that's another real benefit of RAW. Is in RAW, you can change the white balance of your photograph. So I don't really pay much attention to what the white balance setting in camera is, because I can correct it in the basic panel as soon as I get here. And there are several ways that you can do that. The worst way is to pick from the drop-down box on the right-hand side and try to remember the conditions when you took the photograph and click on it, and it will apply the white balance it thinks you need. And it's not very helpful because you won't ever nail the white balance the way you want to. So I leave it as shot, and then instead I either go to the dropper, click on it, and then find me an area of some kind of neutral, mid-gray is best, and click on it. Then Lightroom will reset the white balance around that neutral gray. The most accurate way that you can do it is when you're out taking your photographs in the same light, same conditions, take a photograph of one of these, either the color side or the gray side, and make sure that this panel is nicely in focus. And when you get to that photograph, simply white balance from this panel by using the eyedropper, and that will give you perfect color, because that will correct all the rest of the color, because your white balance will be right. This is super important if you're trying to replicate a color accurately, for example, in product photography or fashion. If you want the dress to be precisely how the dress actually is in terms of color, then use a color card to make sure you're setting the white balance right. So they're the three ways. Well, there's a fourth way. You can just manually slide it. You can change both the temperature, which is basically favoring the oranges or the blues to give you that cold look or that warm look, and the corresponding colors are in the tint slider, which allows you to make your photograph greener or more magenta. And balancing them artistically is fine, but be very careful if you actually have a natural scene. It's very easy to mess up the colors completely by fiddling around too much in this white balance panel especially when you're moving the tint slider from magenta to green. I, generally speaking, leave that pretty much where it is in the midpoint at 0, if I can get it there. And any changes that I do make to the white balance will be in the blue-orange slider. For right now, we're just going to leave it where it is. The next box is the tone box, and this is super important. This is where you are able to adjust the lightness of certain parts of your image. The exposure slider, which I usually don't touch early in the process of editing any photograph, changes the lightness or the darkness of every part of the photograph. See, when I slide the exposure, it's actually lightening the entire photograph as if I had added a stop of exposure in my camera. For example, if I set this on +1, that's like opening up my aperture 1 stop or slowing down my shutter speed 1 stop. No difference. It just lets more light in, and that's what this slider does. You probably should not use it very much. It is a minor tweak at the end if everything else you do doesn't give you the exposure you're looking for. Contrast, I also don't touch at this point, because we're going to be doing a lot of specific alteration to the exposure of different brightnesses within the photograph, and that's going to take care of the contrast. That's going to add a good bit of contrast without touching this slider. So this is really where the money is. You have sliders here for highlights and shadows and whites and blacks, and you should think of those as 2 pairs of sliders as opposed to 4 separate ones. The highlights slider will either lighten or darken the lightest parts of the photograph. Okay? So another way of putting it is, you can lighten or darken the light parts of the photograph without affecting the dark parts. The shadows, on the other hand, will lighten or darken the dark parts of the photograph without affecting the light parts. And that is super useful, as you will see. The white and the black sliders are used to set what's called the white point, and you guessed it, the black point. And the reason that that is important is the white point is the point at which you have lightened the photograph as much as you can before it begins to clip in the lightest parts of the photograph. Remember what I told you about the histogram? The clipping indicators lighting up if an image gets too light in the highlights or too dark in the shadows. Well, with this slider, I can show you. In fact, you can see the histogram is already clipping. So I would have to lower the white slider until that stops. And that is how you set the white point. Similarly with the dark point, the black point, I can slide it to the left until I start to see clipping first there in the greens. So I back off just a bit. Now I've set the white point and the black point. There's another way you can do it. Let's reset those. Just double click on the title of the panel and it'll reset all the settings. Another way to do it is to, while holding your mouse on the slider for white, also press the Alt or Option button on your computer. And then as you slide your white slider, anytime you can see anything on the screen, that is clipping. So you slide it and slide it and slide it until the last bit of clipping disappears. Well, it's not going to just quite disappear for some reason. And the same with the blacks. If you hold the Alt or Option key while depressing the slider, eventually you'll start to see some color creep in. That is clipping. So you back off from that. That's another way to do it. But we are getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. The first thing we need to do is to try to recover as many details as we can from our photograph. And the first place that you can see that we seem to be missing details are in these darker, shadowy areas of the picture. Now, you could think, well, I'll just raise the exposure. Okay, well, you could do that, and you bring back some details from the dark areas, but you're also blowing out the rest of the photograph. So that's obviously no good. So let's leave exposure where it was, and instead, let's go to the shadows slider. And like I said, this will increase the lightness of the dark areas without touching the light areas. So we slide it up all the way, pretty much in this case, but it has brought back the shadows in the areas we couldn't see. I'll slide it back to show you. You can't see the detail in here, but if we bring the shadow slider up, that brings back a fair amount of the detail, and we haven't affected the light parts of the photograph. We're also losing some detail in the water because it is also clipping. It's a little bit too light. So if we lower the highlights, it will reduce the lightness of the lightest parts of the image without messing with the dark parts. So down we go. And it's subtle, but as we do that, you can start to see more detail in the water than you could before when it was clipping. All right, so after I have boosted up the lightness of my shadows and backed off to some amount on the amount of brightness in my lights, now I want to set the white point and the black point so that the light parts of the image are as white as possible without clipping, and the dark parts are as black as possible without clipping. So let's do that now. So to set the white point and the black point, I'm going to use the method I normally prefer. It's quite the simplest. I am going to increase the white slider, move it to the right until I first see clipping. Now, the fact that the colors change is telling you what shades of what colors are light that are peaking first. So we can see that the first thing to peak is the red tones in the light areas of the photograph, probably these leaves that are in the sun. So we've increased the white point just until it peaks and then backed off just till the clipping stops. Now let's go to the black point and lower the slider, take the slider to the left until we see clipping there. It's clipping in the greens, probably of that moss. So by backing off just a little bit, I have no sign of clipping, but the whites are as white as they can be, the blacks are as black as they can be. And what that means is we have actually subtly increased the contrast in the photograph by setting the white and the black points at their optimum position while pulling as much detail as we can out of the shadows and the highlights. And really, that is 90% of your photo editing when you do that. I thought for just a second I saw some peaking. I do. You'll notice this little piece of white in the photograph when I hover over the clipping indicator is showing red, meaning that that has actually lost detail. And I can't lower the highlights any more than I have, but I am going to back off the white. In fact, this might be a good place to back down on the exposure itself. Doing so, of course, is also going to darken the dark areas. And look, we are now clipping in the dark areas, so I can bump up my black point just a hair. There we go. Now, if you ever want to see what your photograph looks like now compared to what it looked like when you started, hit the key Y. And what Y will show you side by side or top and bottom, however you set it up in preferences. It'll show you what the before and after look like. And this is a very, very valuable tool so that you can get a feel for where you need to go next. But I think you'd have to agree that the after looks considerably more natural and pleasant than the before did. As you can tell from looking at this, it was a late afternoon photograph, which actually gives me an idea. I might just ever so slightly warm the image up by using the temperature slider to move the white balance to a little bit warmer hue. And that looks good. That helps bring some of the reds and oranges out in the leaves. Okay, so the last thing we need to talk about is the presence panel. Now, this is a good one. A lot of these sliders are relatively new. The most recent of which is the texture slider. The texture accentuates the details in the areas of the photograph that have a lot of detail, whereas the clarity increases the contrast, but only in the midtones. It doesn't increase the clarity by increasing the contrast. This is basically a very specific contrast adjustment just to the areas of the photograph that aren't very bright, aren't very dark. So as we slide this, you'll see, again, a subtle increase in the contrast of the mid areas of the photograph. Sometimes the best way to see what a slider does is to move it in the opposite direction. As you move the clarity slider to the left, it creates a rather unpleasant homogeneous grayness because it is decreasing the contrast in the areas of the midtones. And it gives some really nice but subtle punch when you add it by moving the slider to the right. With all of these tone and presence sliders, the trick is small adjustments, minor adjustments. You really don't want to see the difference the adjustment made specifically. You don't want to look at the photograph and say, yeah, that's been sharpened. You want it to be to subtly improve the photograph without being an obvious change. So in this case, I think I would bump up the texture to bring out a little bit more detail, but probably not much more than about 9 or 10. And then the clarity maybe as high as 11, but not any higher than that. Dehaze is a fascinating slider. What the dehaze does is it alters the brightness of parts of the image where the Lightroom program feels that atmospheric conditions have created a haze that we want to get rid of. It's hard to describe, but it's not hard to see. If you slide the dehaze button to the right, it will take that haze out of usually the more distant parts of your photograph. If you slide it to the left, it will add haze, and you can see that very clearly with only a moderate amount of dehaze removed. You start to see this atmospheric haze come in. Now, I use that very, very sparingly, but like with all of the tools in Lightroom, they are there for a purpose. This slider is there to remove atmospheric haze, but you can use it to create some very cool effects in your photographs that have nothing to do with removing atmospheric haze. It can add a beautiful softness to some portraits and to night images. It all depends on what you're trying to do. But I would certainly recommend playing around with all three of these sliders to see the effects it has on different photographs. Let's get into the last two, vibrance and saturation. These both deal with color, but in a very specific way. Vibrance will increase or decrease the saturation of colors that are not particularly bright in the image. Examples would be the green moss here around the bottom of this big rock. If we were to slide the vibrance slider to the right, the colors that were not already saturated will be boosted without touching the more saturated colors in the image. However, the saturation slider will saturate everything, both the unsaturated and the saturated colors, leading to usually a very garish, oversaturated picture. And of course, if you take the slider for saturation all the way to the left, well, that's what happens when you desaturate all the colors in a photograph. It becomes black and white. So my recommendation is, after you have worked with the texture, clarity, and dehaze, and maybe bumped up a little bit of vibrance to get some color in the less saturated areas, I would usually recommend bumping the saturation slider down just a little so that you don't oversaturate the colors. Again, what you're looking for is a reality and a subtlety to your edits. So I think that's about good. That's about what I would like to see at the end of editing that in the basic panel. And you can see the comparison between the two is pretty stark, with more detail in the shadows, more detail in the highlights, nicer, punchier colors, a little bit more contrast. Altogether, very happy with that as a basic edit. Y, remember, is the shortcut to give you the before and after. The last thing I'll mention is that after making these changes, because a lot of these sliders interact with one another in subtle ways, we have actually got some clipping in the darkest of the shadows. And I would like to get rid of that on the histogram. Several ways I could do it, but probably I would choose to just bump the black point up a hair. And I would leave it there. I wouldn't do another thing with it. So that is the basic panel. Practice in that and try to stick to that workflow. Don't mess with exposure or contrast unless you have to. And by the way, with the edit now finished, now if I wanted to, I could very slightly move the exposure and the histogram will retain its good shape, because this is a good histogram, but I'm not going to increase the exposure. I like it a bit darker. And it does not need any more contrast. It immediately starts to look fake as you bump it up just a little bit. I would use the contrast that you have pulled out of the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, and leave this contrast right where it was at 0. So that is it. That is the first step in editing your photographs, is to get the basic edit done. And that's all there is to it. Practice. Grab some of your photographs that are high key, the very light ones, and play with the sliders, and then do the same with a dark photograph, so that you can start to get a feel for how each adjustment will work, and certainly do the same with colors. Next week, we are going to be getting into the tone curve and also into the histogram, and learn a different way to arrive at this same result. I hope this was helpful for you. It would have been so helpful for me if somebody had explained all this the first time I sat down with Lightroom, but if you can get this part down, everything else follows from this, and I think you're going to be in good shape. So get lots of practice. I will see you in a very few days, very few short days, I hope, and we'll get into the next level of editing with a tone curve and the histogram. Until then, stay safe, take lots of pictures, have great fun, enjoy the summer, and I will see you very, very soon. Take care. Good night.